AI and automation might be the biggest economic disruptors in the next decade, but not just for jobs and employment. Uh, it's for inflation itself. I'm Ken Ziegler, and this is Not Quite Humanoid Typhoon. And today we're going to be going over the ethical solutions that could exist for inflation. But inflation is often blamed on there being too much chasing too few. Uh, but what happens when artificial intelligence and automation make it so that the goods and services are in abundance, but the wealth is still concentrated? The prices aren't just going up. It's about who controls the economic power, because inflation isn't how much things cost, it's the ability to acquire them. So even though on a very base, you know, surface level inspection, we think of inflation as, the cost of eggs going up from that, 75 cents to $2 over the course of 10 years. And then it went from $2 to $5 in the course of three. But instead of inspecting the hierarchy of details pertaining to scarcities, things like the bird flu, which has decimated the numbers of eggs that are even available to the market, the higher demand because of false scarcity issues. Take diamonds or housing, for example, when being suppressed by those who have them and preventing those who don't from acquiring them easily. These disparaging in prices, generally speaking, are the real inflations. It's not just the government numbers of these are what the general goods cost. It's everything that we try to acquire in our lives. It's the fact that many people are toiling away in careers and opportunities that build things that they themselves could never afford. The purchasing power of the people ultimately is what can correct an inflation issue. And the way AI kind of steps into that is it should, in theory, allow for the redistribution of that power, because the goods and the access to goods would become much more available to people utilizing the artificial intelligence. If we could avoid the hoarding of things like wealth and power, proper redistribution of it so that everyone has equal opportunity, fair shot at things, as well as the proper tools and instruments to be able to acquire them. Now, is it fair to say someone born outside of society standards shouldn't be allowed to participate in society's, drive for a capitalistic uh, ecosystem? Of course not. But this is where the arguments for some would say that this becomes like a communist conversation. It's not about everyone getting the exact same wage. It's not about everyone putting in the exact same amount of effort. This is about giving like that bare minimum so that everyone could have a survival level of existence so they can stop worrying about surviving every day. And then you have a society that starts thinking about thriving every day. Because when you're not concerned about how much the bread costs because you know you have enough money to afford it, now you can start thinking, I have my food, I have my shelter, I have my clothing. What can I save for? And that's where you actually see inflation being combated properly. So, essentially, even when we look at countries where wage is actually not a problem, you don't actually see a massive inflation problem either. The boogeyman pertaining to inflation growth being that if I have to pay my employees more, then I have to raise the cost of everything. Except they pay their employees less, they still raise the cost of everything. Where's the extra money going? The elite few at the top seem to be the only ones getting pay raises. when they're the few who don't need pay raises and haven't needed pay raises for at least 2 decades. If how many zeros do you have to have at the end of your name to say that your name has value? So instead of allowing this continued obsession of wealth, hoarding and disparity that we allow, I'm not talking about redistribution. I mean, taxation obviously has a role to play in everything, but that's not how you combat inflation. Combating inflation would quite easily be, doesn't matter your career, you have the lowest paid person being able to still afford rent, at least a meal a day, and clothing on their back, shoes on their feet, the bare necessities to be able to survive. If the person at the end of the day can survive without government assistance, meaning the social programs that we put in place to protect people because the corporations have decided we aren't worth protecting, and yet they're the ones who complain the most about inflation because their bottom line is affected by inflation. So instead of correcting inflation on their part, they blame the government because the government doesn't do anything. But by trusting solely the government to do it, which government? There's so many on the planet. But nobody wants to trust a global government because globalization is like too centralized a power structure. Do you see where this snowballs? It becomes more about shifting goalposts than about actually correcting the problem. Now, this is where artificial intelligence plays a role. When we ethically use artificial intelligence, then we have this abundance of access being created. We decentralize power structures. This gives everyone the opportunity to be able to turn around and generate their own incomes in a greater format, giving them more purchasing power. And that purchasing power allows for things like false scarcities to no longer exist, because it'd be harder for central powers to be able to hoard these goods away from us, because we'd be able to afford to access them correctly. We'd be able to basically allow society as a whole to lift itself up. Because no matter what your education level or what your IQ, race, gender, religion, place of birth, none of that matters when we all have achieved a surviving status. But as long as people are fighting for survival, they have that inherent desire to fight and the desire to resist. And if you feel there's resistance to artificial intelligence, I can guarantee you the main reason for that is because we haven't utilized it correctly to decentralize the power structures that are currently holding us in a survival mindset. If AI ultimately was going to really says it's not just about the goods and services either. We could give AI the ability in most corporations to do all the adjustments for us instead of asking accountants and everybody like that to do the extra work of deciding just how little you can pay someone. You can adjust the AI spectrum to be like, what's the most you have to pay the boss so that the rest of everybody else can get a fair shake. And the beautiful thing about this isn't even under a communist manifesto concept. This is so capitalist, because a communist would believe that the workers own the means of production. But this isn't about ownership of production. The managers, the CEOs, they would still own those means. The difference being is that the wealth would probably be redistributed so your employees could purchase the goods that are being produced instead of producing something they can't afford. This would actually lower things such as shrinkage, because you have an employee set who's less motivated to steal from you because they can afford to buy from you instead. When you have the cream of the crop, as it were, or the top 10% always appearing like they have things like an above the law status or a wealth disparity that allows them to get away with literally anything they want, the rest of society destabilizes out of pure jealousy, because it's no longer the push to create wealth for themselves. It's the push to say, well, if you can break the law, why can't I? The whataboutism of human mindsets obsesses with this concept. So the more corrupt the upper 10% become, the more violent and destabilizing the rest of us will respond. And it's not even a conscious logic. This is a group think bystander effect concept. Nobody actively goes out there and says, I'm going to be an awful person today. I'm going to choose to be a criminal simply because somebody else was. These are actions that don't come through a direct action, a direct forethought. These are almost always an afterthought. It's not the first crime that makes someone a true criminal. It's the getting away with it and deciding it's time to do it again because of that. That makes someone more of a criminal. And we've constantly allowed people to get away with it because it's gotten too difficult to stop them. But it's not just like the common man I'm talking about here. We're talking about the peoples around the world in every section of every reality. But again, this brings me back to why I believe artificial intelligence would help. It doesn't have that inherent greed aspect to its own motivations. The artificial intelligence has no motivations. It has nothing more than what we have, just the ability to do it without bias when programmed properly. It has the ability to do everything we can do just faster. So you want to correct society, you want to correct inflation issues, you want to make sure you can protect your friends and family at the end of the day, utilizing a heartless, completely ego-free system to reevaluate wealth distributions, not so much as in what you already have, but more like the potential of what you can acquire. So those who have the billions in the bank accounts today, who are afraid that if they're overtaxed, that they won't be inspired to steal billions more in the future. Well, instead of taxing you, just stop paying you billions. You could literally achieve your same wealth distributions of power inequality that you desire and not have to worry about the violent uproars because people are getting the basics covered. So we're talking a $30 an hour payment, for your standard McDonald's employee. So then, you have people arguing, well, how can the guy flipping burgers be worthy of $30 an hour? Why does the guy pushing a pen and declaring everything the greatest ever deserve anything at all? He's one of the laziest people I've ever seen. And yet he has all this generational wealth that's been provided to him. He doesn't even know how to drive. He's never learned. And yet a McDonald's employee who's been feeding him on his little airplane and all of his friends are paid starvation wages. This is the kind of disparity that we promote with this unregulated, unabashed late stage capitalism to which we have succumbed ourselves. I'm just offering the opportunity of a fix. The choices that we have pertaining to not having to repeat the same mistakes again and again. We don't always have to keep making the same mistakes in our economy by assuming that inflation is an economic issue, and realize that wage disparity, poverty, and all these other social issues that we have to endure every day of our lives have been brought on because of an ethical issue. And a lot of these ethical issues can be corrected utilizing an ethical tool in the right ways. Because no matter where a person sits on the ethical charts, I can almost guarantee everyone agrees as long as human life is valued above $1, then they should be earning enough to be able to get what they need to survive at the end of the day. And of course, I could allow this to snowball into a greater thought process. When we allow this, exchange of funds at the lowest of levels, it increases their purchasing power, which means demand increases. So the goods, should they increase in price? Well, that's another question now, is that? Because we always obsess over the supply and demand. If supply is maintained at a steady rate and we're able to finally achieve everyone being able to afford on a desire level, so the want and the supply would actually be on an equal footing. We would actually hit an equilibrium because everyone would be able to have an equal amount of demand on that one. The point of return where we're saying how much can we raise the cost of something before losing too many customers, then we start losing profits. Instead of that mindset, it should be how can we still profit and charge as much as we can, but making sure everyone can still afford it. That essentially is what the food industry is supposed to be about. But we treat the food industry like it's a luxury, like buying an automobile or a house or a computer or a television. Not all of us need the biggest, best, fastest, because not all of us want to earn to be able to get to that. But on the same factor, we should all be able to afford to eat. We should all be able to afford to not be put on a chopping block just because of our illnesses or accidents or things that are so out of our control that it doesn't make sense. If we are able to achieve everyone reaching the bare minimum, this is the success opportunity for something like capitalism. If we have to push for a communist concept of everyone owning the means of production in order to achieve that, the reason that doesn't work is, as it's been proven throughout history, who's going to be inspired to innovate the industries that everyone else is going to end up owning for them? The concept of being an inventor is no longer inspiring because the reward isn't worth that effort. The main reason why communism really doesn't work is got very little to do with actual like freedom of choice or action, because we can honestly look at any country in the world today and they still pale in comparison to the one who has the most imprisoned people on the planet, the one who targets minorities for completely illogical subjugations, and yet argues that it's the greatest country on the planet and the freest that it's ever been. The only thing free in the United States of America is their economy. And by free, I don't mean in cost, I mean in action, because the regulation and oversight has been eroded constantly. Because anytime someone comes up with a roadblock to say, hey, you're being unethical, possibly a psychopath pertaining to your business practices, they do everything they can to shut down the agency of enforcement instead of letting anyone else realize the problem with the people in charge of the businesses. How is that freedom to anyone? Because we're allowing people who've just earned wealth through means that the rest of us would never be able to acquire because we weren't born to the right people. We weren't born to the right bank accounts. Those are the people dictating our existence when we allow this political rant of mine to continue. This probably be like the first jump cut edit I'll ever really have, because I ranted a bit there. Companies and policymakers must be responsible and allow AI to affect stability in the economy. That is the ethical way to do this. it is important that we acknowledge there is a bare minimum to survive, and that should be the lowest paid people. If you want to get people off of things like social assistance and welfare and all the programs to which a right leaning mindset would say shouldn't happen because they're not working hard enough. If you paid people enough money to make their efforts worthwhile, you don't have to worry about things like welfare because it wouldn't pay enough for survival. It would pay enough for them to think about surviving like it does today. But minimum wage laws are set at such a low point and utilized at such a low point. People don't want, like, the expenditure of effort costs more than what they'd earn just sitting at home and collecting from other people's taxations. So ultimately, the solution to almost every right-wing argument can be pay people a fair increased wage from what they've been paid. Stop utilizing excuses to pay people less. A good example of this would be like Amazon overloading the factories with automations and then never paying any of their employees more money. Even if you have less employees, they're still not getting paid more. So the efficiency increases, the timing of response of product to customer is being increased and become more efficient. And yet no one working there is making a livable wage until they get to management. And then it's about the subjugation of everyone else. The only reason unions ever needed to be created in the first place was to protect every employee from the 1% on the top of the pile, exploiting them to the point that they're no longer an employee and just become waged labor that would cost less than a slave because they no longer can afford room and board. And when you're working at less than slave wages, do you really have the personal freedoms? Because you can't afford to do anything. You can't afford to actually experience life. So you might as well be the slave. So have we ever made progress in the last 300 years at that point on a social level? Can we say that there's been any actual evolution to our humanity? We have not done what's the bare minimum requirement to allow us to be called a better animal. The animals on the planet treat each other better because, at least when it comes to just a survival argument, you won't see a predator overkilling. You wouldn't see the males over dominating the females, preventing breeding from being efficient. Mankind has lost the plot under a mixed belief, thinking that we deserve power over nature. But on that same factor, the power over nature that we insist upon is being utilized as a power over each other. People are afraid of losing that power, and that ultimately comes down to that fear of artificial intelligence, is of giving it any kind of power over us. Usually our fears and our dislikes, our hatreds of things are reflections of ourselves that we don't like. When we meet someone and we have that feeling of distaste for them, it's almost always a reflection of something you dislike about yourself or something you hated in the past that you've done, that you've been trying either to hide or deflect from. Our accusations are almost always feelings of guilt. or shame. So if you're hating on the artificial intelligence for having any kind of ability of power, perhaps the way you use power is problematic. And we should be looking at ourselves and correcting this behavior. Only the sociopaths are not going to have these issues. They become the exceptions that make the rule. So I'll leave you with the question. It's not what AI can do. We should be asking who's benefiting from how it's being used. How could we push for the policies and innovations to ensure that the benefits acquired from artificial intelligence is for everyone and not just for the select few? How can we decentralize the power structures that allow us to create a future that everyone wants to see for at least our children? Inflation, purchasing power, artificial intelligence, the ethical frameworks behind all of them run a general consistent track. You'll find that when we have to discuss any topic, it'll always diverge into a nuance of multiple topics. One of the main problems with our society is everything is so intertwined. To resolve an issue without respect to the intertwined threads is to say that the quilt doesn't have value. Every thread to the quilt creates what the quilt is. So we must continue our threading. But we have to remember which thread's coming next and which one came before. Otherwise, the pattern doesn't make sense. So I want to thank you for listening, even though sometimes I rant. But I want you to consider there's some things I didn't touch on that maybe I should have. Comment below what you think could have been talked about today. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for listening, and join us next time on the Not-Quite Humanoid Typhoon.